Welcome, welcome, friends. We are just getting settled in here. We'll be starting in just a moment or two. Very excited to have you. In this series, we like to invite a new thinker, author, or teacher to share their wisdom to help us better understand ourselves and the people around us. One of Holste's 12 themes is kinship, and today's session is going to dive into one of the hardest parts of kinship, and that's repairing relationships. And I honestly can't think of a better guest speaker for that topic than our guest today, Jeffrey Farr. Jeffrey is a self-described, unabashed, and unapologetic word geek who loves the logistics and interplay of language. Just hearing the way he speaks honestly gives me a greater appreciation of the English language. After changing lives as an English teacher, Jeffrey spent a decade helping to bring restorative practices to the Maryland school system. And this is a man who just simply radiates kindness and wisdom. And I'm so honored that he's taking the time today to be with us. We did have a small moment where we realized that time zones got the best of us, but that's okay. We're still going to make it work. But you'll notice that Jeffrey is going to be in a little bit of transit for parts of this call, but we're trying to minimize that impact as much as possible. All right, Jeffrey, so wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you.
So wonderful. Yeah, I'll let you kind of maybe introduce the session a little bit and the direction we want to take it from here.
What we have today, I'll do some full disclosure. I was so excited that they made me look halfway decent looking in the promo. I only looked at me, not at the time. And we had a glitch because I had said I need to be on the road at 2:15 to catch a plane. And California was hearing 2:15 their time, and I was sure that I'm the center of the universe. So I was thinking 2:15 my time. And it wasn't until this morning that I realized, oh, I will be talking while being driven to the LaGuardia airport. So in advance, my apologies. I'm working off of my itty bitty phone. I will not see your comments. Michael will be managing those and interrupting me with your better thoughts. So that's where we are. Restorative practices that I've worked with is it's a mind shift, I guess I would call it, of focusing on building community and having a way to repair relationships, because inevitably, even in our relationship with ourselves, we will have differences and we will cause harm, and we need to be able to repair them. So an example, this is a little bit out of the order, but one of the concepts that we'll be going over here briefly is called the compass of shame. Can we pop that slide up? All right. So the concept here, and this is borrowed from else's writings, but the compass of shame is when we are in a pleasurable moment, which I was thinking about this, when I thought that I had messed up the time, I went right into the circle in the center of that compass of shame. And so now I've got to get out. And we have basically 4 ways that people get out. Most of us have 2 favorite ways of doing it. So my first thought was, and I almost went there, oh, those darn people, they messed up the time. That's attacking others. But then I realized that I'd had weeks to review the material. And so now I start thinking, well, I messed up. I'm attacking myself. Some people go into withdrawal, and that's where they isolate or self-medicate. When I was teaching students, I had a lot of students who would self-medicate with substances, legal or not, in order to try to pull themselves out of the center of here. And then you have avoidance as well, which is where you really go at it. Now, the purpose of this is that when we have a relationship where we made a mistake or we've caused harm and we realize that, we find ourselves in the middle of that compass, and we're going to find a way out one way or the other. For example, when I was 50 years old, I went back to school as a teacher. And I taught students who were labeled as those kids, high school kids who weren't fitting in any other place. And so they'd send them to us. And I was the fascinating 10th grade English teacher. They were so happy to see me. So these were students who had learning difficulties, behavior difficulties, were going to or from incarceration. And we would have some headbutts. And the hard thing for me was to realize that when we had conflict, whatever the response was, it was then getting out of the circle, out of the compass. And I had to let that go, not respond to it. So, for example, I had a young man who continued to use profanity, and he just swore a blue streak one day in class, and I said, come on. And we stepped briefly just outside the door, and I started going at him. Wow, just come on. We had an agreement. I was holding him responsible. And while I was talking to him, he kept looking down. He was attacking himself, putting himself down, showing guilt and shame. And I kept saying, look at me when I'm talking to you. And so every time he did what I wanted him to do, I was kicking him right back into the center. I found a better expert than me who will talk about this idea of harming self or others, and that is Mr. Rogers. And while he's talking to us in this video, I'm going to go get in the car and head to New York. I'll be right back.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeffrey.
But you know, the toughest thing is to love somebody who has done something mean to you, especially when that somebody has been yourself. Have you ever done anything mean to yourself? Well, it's very important to look inside yourself and find that loving part of you. That's the part that you must take good care of and never be mean to, because that's the part of you that allows you to love your neighbor. And your neighbor is anyone you happen to be with at any time of your life. Respecting and loving your neighbor can give everybody a good feeling.
All right. Now we're going to have the grand experience here. Notice that he talks about that we can harm ourselves as well as others. Brown makes the point that it's really only possible when we accept our own vulnerabilities, that we are indeed a work in progress, and we recognize ourselves as that we can truly recognize other people as works in progress. And if we both realize we're working on ourselves, then we can form connections, then we can build, instead of trying to establish who's at fault. So one of the core premises of restorative practices is this idea of working with. That people and organizations are more likely to work with each other and to work successfully with each other if they feel like they are working with each other, or instead of doing things to each other or having things done to them. So, Michael, if we could pull up the social discipline window. There we are. So no concept can be without their 4-grid rubric here. So what we have is 2 dimensions. One, high expectations, and that's the uppy-downy. And the lefty-righty is support. So I'd like you to just take a minute and think about somebody who's been particularly impactful in your life in a positive way. Somebody who's made a difference. And let's just take a minute or so and write down 2 words that you think describe that person. And they'll come in handy a little bit later on. You won't be asked to share them, and unless you feel comfortable doing that in the chat, I suppose. But I won't require that you share them publicly. Just take a minute and jot those down. All right. And if you're still thinking, that's fine. What this concept of working to with, doing things with each other instead of to and for, is at the heart of the concept of restorative practices. Maybe I should define it a little bit. There are numerous instances, and you'll find them in the news, and you can find them on the web, where the concept of restorative justice is shown. And that's used often in working with youth and keeping people out of the school to prison pipeline. If we can resolve our differences, then we don't need to have anybody sent off or suspended or be involved with the legal system. And so we try to work with each other instead of doing things to or for each other. So, for example, when I was in school, the 4 box, that's the rule. And part of me says I think every organization needs to have this, but the 4 box was the classroom down the corner where she always had a Twinkie and a blanket, and you could go in and you knew you would be soothed and everything would be fine. But that is doing everything for. I will comfort you. There's nothing wrong here, and you're safe. We all kind of like to find that sometimes. The 2 box, we have all been to. We've been in a relationship where somebody is about control, or we have had a boss that was very much my way or the highway, and we will do it this way, and you will do it this way, and there are no other options. As a teacher, when I cannot believe that they were not delighted with my lesson plan every day. But when the little rascals were not paying attention very much, or my carefully crafted lesson plan was falling like a Chinese weather balloon, I would revert to 2. All right, then everybody start writing an essay, that sort of thing. And so one of the challenges I'm going to ask you to do is to just track which square you're in throughout the day. I tend to wander between the with and the to and seek to become with. Now, the challenge is when everybody else is sitting in the 2 or the 4, or heaven forbid the not. Those are the people that are quietly quitting, I guess is the term we use now, that are just not engaged, do not wish to be engaged. They are just going to hunker down and get through. It's often between our desire to be with and other people's practice of being to that conflict arises. And so here's where building community comes in. And we have community when we're with other people, in personal relationships, in our families, in our work environment. In my case, it was working with students in a classroom. And we are hardwired to want to belong to community. And when we don't feel that we are, when we feel we're disconnected, or when others feel they are disconnected, that's where the danger lies. We're familiar with the saying that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, there's another saying that those who are not made part of the village, who are excluded from the village, will burn it down so that they might feel its warmth. I think it's important for us to understand that when we are disconnected, be it from our true selves, as Brene Brown would say, or from community, that we tend to do things that are not productive. Some of us have been that person on the outside looking in who tries to overcompensate and actually engages more intensely in the behaviors that are upsetting other people and driving them to exclude us, or we've been the recipient of that type of behavior. And so this concept of becoming community and building it is so critical, because in a very large sense, we rely upon each other, not only for worth, but for the connections that allow us to be complete and whole.
Jeff, we just had a question come through.
Yeah, go ahead.
Joe says, if someone else is being not, how can you deal with that? If someone won't show up emotionally, are you then restricted to being either 2 or 4, or are there ways around that?
I want you to think of a bagel. And right in the center of that bagel is your circle of influence. That is what you actually can do something about. Okay? And then the bagel itself is your circle of concern. These are things that you worry about, but over which you have very little control. And everything else out there is extra concerns or world affairs. So ultimately, we are only able to control our own response. So when we have somebody who stays in the not box until they feel comfortable enough and safe enough to be vulnerable enough to open up, they're going to stay in the not box. It's very safe in the not box. You don't risk anything because you've already chosen to be socially isolated. For Joel's question, why don't we pop up the affective statement? This is not unique to restorative practices. In fact, very little is unique to restorative practices, as opposed to the restorative justice paradigm, which is largely this is how we react after harm has occurred. About 80% of restorative practices is proactive. It's the building community part. And 20% or so is reactive. How do we rebuild the relationships? So affect is how we display or communicate emotion. So when I had my little group in the back corner of my classroom and they were talking, or unfortunately after somebody decided I was to let them have their phones out and on during class because they could be a learning tool, I could say, put away your phones or quit talking. And immediately then the defenses go up and you enter into the noise level thermostat of relationships. And when we were teenagers, we found out what that was. I can keep doing what I'm doing until mom or dad's voice gets so loud, and then I'd better act. So I'm tuned out. Plus, I'm attacking them, which puts them back in this compass of shame that we were talking about. But if in my conversations, I could say, well, Fred, I'm feeling just a little concerned or a little nervous that I'm not pulling my weight, or I'm not understanding your point of view when I don't get feedback from you. That makes me nervous. And when you start off with how I feel, that's showing the effect of somebody's actions, or in this case, probably inactions. And that helps people understand that what we do affects others, and the focus is on the effect of our actions. If you could throw in the because, it further explains what's going on. And so learning affective statements and language, and those of you who have studied or tracked nonviolent communication, this is at the core. You may have gone to classes or workshops where they talk about I statements. This is all that sort of thing. And by doing that, I would teach my students empathy. And by being vulnerable enough to talk about how I was feeling at the time, and you could do it positively. Instead of saying, oh, that's cool, I could say, oh, I'm really excited at what you have done, or it makes me happy when you do such and such. And generally, 5 positives to 1 negative is a good ratio when we're trying to build a relationship. So that's how I would approach my knots. Many of my students were knots. And I had to give them the time to feel safe. And I had to demonstrate being vulnerable and allow them to do what they had learned so far as what kept them safe. That might be, this is less a knot, but a lot of times we have people who will strike before being struck. They will attack so that they have a sense of control before somebody else can hurt them. And that's where, again, at that center of the compass of shame, you have to let the first shot go by. Sometimes you have to be willing and recognizing you're trying to get out as well. Some of you were involved in a book talk on Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart. Here's my compass of shame. I was going to be to that, and my wife and I were traveling, and I got talking and realized I had missed the whole thing. my first thought was to go online and attack myself or attack others, because I was going to say, well, we had bad Wi-Fi, which we did in the hinterlands of Pennsylvania. But the reality is it was my fault. So by being vulnerable and showing that you can take responsibility for your impact and share with other people what their impact is in a non-threatening way, will generally eventually melt down the resistance. Other questions or responses?
Jeff, I have a question. Where do you draw the line between doing something for and with? I feel like there's possibly a gray zone of trying to extend the olive branch and be very supportive, but not going beyond the degree to which someone should also be there with you and helping out as well.
For doing things for is we're focused on enabling and feeding our first responder needs. I will take care of you. You don't have to do anything. I'm the one who will solve your problems. A lot of times, actually, I've got a really good, I had a really good quote, but basically, you're telling that person, you're telling the other people that I know what is best for you and I will do things for you so that you don't have to. Whereas with is saying we are equal and I need what you have and anything I have, you might. And let us do this together. In some of our other meetings, I've talked about the book, My Grandfather's Blessings. And in the preface to that book, she makes the point that when we approach relationships or other people on the concept of I'm here to save you or to help you or to fix you, that's an unequal relationship. That is saying you lack, I have. If you have any common sense, you'll let me make you over in my image. Whereas when we share and serve each other, then it is both symbiotic and reciprocal. And that is the with. Do we have time here for a real quick? I can give you a confession example of what when I was forced to learn that experience. But if there are other questions or directions, I'd much rather this conversation be driven by what interests the group than what I think is important.
Yeah, how about, well, I'll take a moment. I'll invite anyone, whether it's a thought or question, feel free to add it to the chat and I can share it with Jeff since he's not seeing the comments at the moment. But Jeff, maybe in the meantime, while those are coming in, if you want to share that anecdote.
All right, so I was 50 years old when I became a teacher. And so I'm already out of touch with what the students are doing. But then I get the students who largely have been misunderstood and mislabeled by the adults in their lives for a decade or more. So I had this one group that was usually pretty good, but we had one young man who was a walker. It was almost physically impossible for him to sit still during a class. He had to move, whether that was his anxiety or the way he dissipated, or that's how he felt safe, whatever it was. So we set up a little area in the back of the classroom, marked it off with some tape on the floor, and that was his walk zone. He could get up anytime he wanted, and he could walk back and forth in the back of the class. He was behind everybody else, and he could answer questions and participate, and he did not need permission to go back there. Well, one day, he was looking at his phone while he was walking, and something came across the screen that really set him off. He started clenching his fist. I could see his body tighten. He started pounding the blackboard that was in that section, and I was afraid he was going to grab a chair and throw it across the room, quite honestly. So I decided I would put my teacher training. We call it proximity control. So I moved in between him and the rest of the class, which put him kind of back in a corner, but that way I was there in case anything happened. It was going to happen to me and not one of the students. Well, he began more agitated. His posture, his language became very aggressive. Eventually, he gave me a two-handed shove in the chest, walked by me, did toss a chair, walked out of the room. I looked out, saw that the Farr teacher, like I said, sometimes we need that. The Farr teacher had picked him up, and so I knew he was safe. And so I turned around and I looked, and there were the other 8 or 9 students with the deer in the headlight look. And I remembered that all of the research says at the point where there's this sort of trauma, or because we'd all his behavior had been very aggressive, that I had at least 20 minutes before anybody in that room, their brain would be in any position to learn. It didn't matter. I could put on a pink tutu and dance to Swan Lake, and I was not going to get through to any of them. So I sat down, we gathered everybody up in a circle, which is perhaps the most visible evidence that somebody is practicing restorative practices. There's a lot of things happens in circles. And I said, okay, obviously that didn't work. So I'm going to sit here and we'll go around the circle, and I would like you to tell me what you would have done, or what I should have done, or what I missed. And I will sit here without talking, listen, and I'm going to take some notes. And out of all the feedback you give me, I will choose 2 things to work on so that I do better next time. And so they began. It was somewhat akin to being awake for your own autopsy. They said I was worried more about control than what was bothering him. I learned that he had been physically abused, and it was usually when he was in the corner that he was beaten by adults in his life. I was told what I needed to do and what I should have done. And so before class the next day, that student and I met, because technically it was on, I worked with cameras in the classroom, so it was recorded that he had committed technically simple assault. And the normal response would be to suspend him, or in his case, since he had already had a brush or 2 with juvenile services, he would have been a candidate for being violated and sent back to detention. So then we sat together and went over what we will talk about here in a little bit, the restorative questions. And I let him go first. So we both sat, we had a mediator who would ask these questions of both of us. I would always let the student go first because of the power differential. So the moderator would say what happened, and what were you thinking of at the time? And I've yet to have a student say what they were thinking of. This is a way of saying, what were you feeling? What have you been thinking about since? I think Mr. Farr was a real jerk. Who's been affected? And so then we talked about he had, I was, the class was, everybody in the hallway, everyone on social media had all heard about our interaction. There's another question I like to add in sometimes. What has been most difficult for you in all of this? And then what do we need to do to make things right? And that's the money question. None of those questions was about who was at fault. I was in the room too. I'm the guy who triggered him. So I have to take some responsibility. And by letting him go first, I always learned I got a better view of what my part in all of this was. And that way I could address it when the questions were given to me. And we went straight through all of the questions with each of us, and we learned to listen to each other. It's when we truly listen, give that gift of listening to other people, that we acknowledge them and reaffirm their worth, because I'm more interested in hearing you than I am about justifying me. So at the conference, I said, okay, this is what I think I can do. And I let them know that we'd had a conference in the classroom. I told him what I'd agreed to do. And I said, when we get back into class, I'm going to gather them in a circle, and I will admit I'll take responsibility for what I've done wrong. And I will ask them to reaffirm any suggestions. And then I will ask if you want to say anything, you can or not. And then I would tell, when we met, very few of the students would publicly take ownership in the group. But I would start saying, these are the things that I did wrong. These are what you've suggested. This is what I'm going to do. And that class that had been a problem, I had a good month, if not a good month and a half, without any other problems, because we had been honest and vulnerable with each other.
I think one of the great things that I heard that you did in the beginning of the interaction was, I'm just going to sit and listen.
Yep.
I'm not going to make judgments. I'm not going to offer advice. And I think that for a person who is coming from that perspective, that's such a breath of fresh air, because a lot of times they just have which is, I guess, the core of this. They have feedback and language and people telling them what they need to do, and there's obviously a lot that they just want to be heard about.
It's interesting. We always want justice for the other guy, but when we're in trouble, we want mercy. All right. And listening and validating that most behavior is expressing an unmet need. Right? So if we go to the point that your behavior is how you are satisfying a need, you may not know the best way, but that's how you're satisfying that need, whether it be for protection, for safety, for not appearing weak, for whatever it is. Then we recognize each other as people, as folks in progress. And so, yeah, the listening and the not judging, it is hard. My wife is sitting in the next seat, and where I divide her on, she would tell you how much I am still a work in practice. So it is difficult when in the fray, when we are being attacked, to realize the first response is them trying to get out of that circle, or out of the compass.
Jeffrey, we have another question here. This one is from Jess Breach. She says, how do we start working with someone who has done emotional harm to us?
I would go to the affective statements, particularly if the harm is ongoing. If you're still in the situation where you're getting socked, the person may or may not know what they're doing. But by our affective statements, we talk about the impact on us. I feel disrespected. I feel hurt. I feel like I'm not understood when you don't listen, when we don't speak, or when you do this. I haven't told them to stop. The first words out of my mouth are, this is how it's affecting me. And so there are fewer defensive shields that go up. Now, if you're in an organization, and many organizations are beginning to adopt this. A lot of universities use it in the residential halls. We've got some cities that are trying to become restorative so that everybody from the lunch crew at the school to the officers, if you still got them, to juvenile authorities, everyone is trying to practice being restorative. But you can ask these questions of somebody else too. Yeah, I feel really disrespected when this, or I felt threatened when this happened. Can I ask, what do you think happened? What were you thinking of? I know I'm affected. How did it affect you? This is what was hardest for me. What was hardest for you? What do we need to do to make things right? Fixing relationships and trying to help other people grow, it is not about continuing to endure emotional, physical, or any other type of abuse that places you in a situation that's unsafe. This is a method of fixing that and restoring it. And if you're in a situation where there could be legal complications, it's a way of making things right, offering restitution, a way for restitution and extending grace without having to follow the punitive model. So I think it's important I think we have to take a look at ourselves and say, I just don't want to continue being hurt. Where can I go? What are my resources? And then this gives you a way of working it out. The reality is If we could yell, scream, punish, incarcerate, or beat people into being better people, we would have accomplished it some centuries ago. If we could expel our way to better schools, we would have done it. And so you have to let go of that. I want justice for the other guy. He has hurt me so much that he will not try to hurt me anymore. He has punished me, I will punish him more. And that's hard to let go of. And you have to do a lot of prep. Most of this you can do at home. But most of this, don't try it based on this 45 minutes worth of yakking. Okay. Yeah. My first circle and conference was an absolute bloodbath because I had not built any relationship, and I decided I was going to come in and fix them. It was very much a two experience. It did not end well.
Jeff, I have a quick question. Sorry, it's actually a question from me. I was curious, should you be jumping right to from, if we're looking at this kind of ladder here, and you have the negative affects on the bottom, the neutral and the positive affects.
These are called the 9 affects. And I've been using the word shame a lot. I think Nathanson and Tompkins, who worked on this, might choose a different word. But here's the idea. We can be in a pleasurable state. We have gone to visit grandma, and she has just made chocolate chip cookies. They are warm. The chips are gooey. She has just set some out on the cooling rack, and the doorbell rings and she goes. We see cookies. Now, she told us not to touch one, but we're 5 years old, and we're sure she won't notice if one or two are missing. So we are in a very pleasurable emotional state. We reach for one, and just as we finish it and have chocolate smeared all over our fingers and our mouth, Grandma walks back in and she says, "Jeffrey, what have you done? I told you not to touch those." And I've suddenly gone from enjoyment and pleasure and delight to what's called a startle response. I'm caught. And now I start off with shame, which is, ooh, this is not good. I don't feel good anymore. And the longer I stay in that state, the longer I stay in the center of the compass of shame, the more and more I reinforce to myself and others that I am a bad person. Now, again, we're just coming off of that book. Brene Brown makes the point that shame is negative. Shame or reinforces our feelings that we're not good or that I don't have worth. Whereas guilt is, no, I'm not a bad person. I'm just a good person that sometimes do bad or thoughtless things. And so this idea of affect here with the scale shows how deep negative can go. He coined a thing, I'm not sure if it's on there, Dissmell. And that is kind of like I'm going to be coming home from a trip. And if we didn't get everything out of the refrigerator that we should have, when I open that baby up after about 3 weeks, I will be in Dissmell. That's how you just can't stay there. And so the idea is to recognize you're in that startled response. You're in a moment of shame. Now let's get out of it. Make a joke about yourselves, take ownership for what's going on, gently rail against the system and move out. However you get out of the center of that compass, get back up there to where we're being positive again.
Jeffrey, we had a question actually, and you kind of touched on it, but Michelle was asking, what is Dissmell, or am I pronouncing that right? Dissmell or Dismal?
Dissmell at the bottom.
Dissmell. Okay.
That's just the worst. That is taking the skunk spray full in the face. Okay, and you just, nothing about life or your current situation is bearable, and you just can't stand it anymore. That's what Dissmell is at the bottom. That's worse than discouragement. That's worse than despair. Hopefully, we're not there very often.
And just to clarify, like anger is a very intense, active emotion for people.
Yep.
How would you contrast the two?
Anger in this concept. Again, I'm going back to the compass. We can direct the anger towards ourselves, or we can attack others. It's your fault. You know, we had the perfect example this morning when I finally caught on that I had not paid attention and I was going to be traveling during this presentation. All right. So I caught myself initially wanting, like I said, angry at myself. I then maybe wanted to shift it to, well, you guys should have known what I was thinking. But the longer we stay in the anger, the more we reinforce our feelings, or we make other people unable to get out of that. And anger becomes destructive. Brene Brown in the book talked about flooding. When you're too overwhelmed with emotion, anger, frustration, that simply saying, I need 20 minutes. She talked it a little bit in there about, when if she's distracted or frustrated, she's saying, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't really listening to you. I'm involved with this right here. And can we talk in just a little bit? That's very much affective language. It's not, why do you keep interrupting me? It's, I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention because other stuff is going on.
I was just going to say we have one more question, and then we're going to start to wrap things up because we're coming on the end of the hour here. We have this question from Joe. She says, does restorative communication work best with a mediator? For instance, if someone has been knowingly behaving badly? And then she has the follow-up, i.e. where they've received your affective statement and behavior hasn't changed.
I prefer a sit down with somebody who just is in the middle, who's been trained in these, and will ask without emotion or pinning blame, ask both of us the questions. That's not always possible. In which case, then you have to be very gentle in asking those questions of other people. Because the focus, again, is how do we make things right, not why are you a jerk and I'm a saint. So it's more effective if somebody else is asking those questions. It removes the power dynamic, particularly if the person who's causing harm is a supervisor. So yeah, I would prefer to have a mediator.
Jeffrey actually wrote a poem. So what we're going to do is, we've never done this before. We've done it in our smaller member gatherings, but we're going to do a group reading. So you'll see this poem that I'm about to pull up is split into 4 stanzas. And whoever feels called to, we'll just take turns reading one each of these the stanzas in here. Okay. This is Wings by Jeffrey Farr. Most wondrous of all in our search for the sublime is what we, unique creatures all, can share a touching of this kind.
Can touch and soar much farther than before. When alone we groped, when alone we stood ground fast, and shouted curses at those that flew, stretched out our hands to stars that others knew, but we would never know, for in our quiet desperation of standing fast, we had forgotten how to grow.
Forgotten that a quiet word in a noise-filled world goes not unheard, and that tears shed for loves, both won and lost, bring wings of joy well worth the cost of sharing. It is in caring that we learn to fly with those who once flew above us in the sky.
And whose outstretched hands have clasped the hands of those still standing fast. We learn the secret of heaven flight, when, led from darkness into light, we reach behind for those yet there, and soar on wings of caring into the air.
Beautiful. Thanks for making that experiment happen. I really enjoyed that. Maybe we'll make that a part of the speaker series tradition. We're going to wrap up. I love the questions, love the conversation. Jeffrey, thank you so much for making it work. I was ready to reschedule and you said, let's plow through and make it happen. So I'm so glad you did. I think this was a great experiment of building the airplane as we were flying, as you said. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.